For and while loops are tools you're going to use in any program you want to write. As usual, the concepts in this video can be applied to many different programming languages, but the examples we do will be using Java. While loops. While loops are used to run some code while a specific condition is true. If you want to learn more about conditions, there's a section in my video on conditional statements that goes over it in depth. Here we have an empty Java class where we're just going to experiment a bit and show you how to use loops. First, we're just going to initialize a basic variable and call it x and set it to 0. So int x equals 0. Next, let's say we want to print out this line, hello pizza. We want to print out this line 5 times. We could of course copy this line and paste it 4 more times, and now when we run this code, it'll print out hello pizza 5 different times. But there is of course a less tedious way to doing this. With while loops, we can do something like this. First, we write our while keyword, and then in a pair of parentheses, we write our condition. In this case, we're going to set our condition that x is less than 5. And then in order to put the code that we're going to actually run, we have to open some curly braces and write the code in here. Now if I take this line printing out hello pizza and put it in the while loop, this is essentially saying while x is less than 5, run this line of code. Normally it would run all the code inside the curly braces, but in this case we only have this line, so it will only print out hello pizza, but it'll keep on printing while x is less than 5. So now if we run the code, you can see that it just prints hello pizza, but it prints it infinitely. It does not stop printing it because x will always be less than 5. When it finishes this line of code, it checks, okay, is x still less than 5? And since x never changes from 0, x is always going to be less than 5, so it will always be printing hello pizza. One thing we can do so that the loop is not an infinite loop and we only want to print it 5 times is we can say at the end of the loop, x equals x plus 1. So now at the end of every single loop, we're going to say x is now the current x value plus 1. So every single time we go through the loop, it'll actually increment x by 1. So now if we run the code, you can see that it'll actually print out hello pizza 5 different times. For a more clear example, we can also just use numbers. So let's say int number equals 0. While number is less than 7, print out the number. And then at the end of it, we're going to increment number by 1. This is also shorthand to just say number is number plus 1. It's what we did in the last one, but it's just an easier way to write it. Now if we try and run the code, you can see that it'll actually print out our values from 0 all the way to 6. And 6 is the last value it prints out because we're saying while number is less than 7. If we were to say while number is less than or equal to 7, then it will actually, when we run the code, it'll actually end up printing 7 as well. One variation of a while loop is called a do-while loop. A do-while loop is the same thing as a while loop, except it actually runs the code before checking the condition. Here's an example. Let's say we have an integer count, and we'll set it to 0. We can say do, and then we can print out my count is, and then our value. After this, you have to include a while statement, so this will have to say while count is less than 4. And in the do loop, make sure to increment count, otherwise this will be an infinite loop. We can see now when we run the code, it will actually print my count for every single value up to 3 because 3 is less than 4. Well then in this case it works exactly like a while loop and there's no difference. But there are some cases where it actually makes a difference. Let's say our count had to be less than 0, for example. Now if we try and run this code, you can see it'll actually still run. Even though count isn't less than 0, count is 0, so this should never even run in the first place. But we're saying do this and then check the condition. So there are some cases where you are going to want to run something that is loopable before putting it in a whole loop. For loops are used to run some code while a condition is true, and you can initialize variables and increment them in the same statement. Each for loop has 3 components that are separated by semicolons. The first part is where we're going to be initializing our variables. Most of the time, these are variables that are going to be used to count through iterations of the loop. The second part is going to be our condition. Just like how we have a condition in our while loop, it essentially works the same way. And the last part is where we can increase or decrease our initialized variables at the end of every single loop iteration. Next, as always, whatever code we're actually going to be looping through is contained within curly braces after this for statement. Like we said, a for loop condenses every part of a while loop and puts it into one statement. So here we can put for, we'll set our initialized variable as I and we'll set it to 0. For our second statement, we'll say while I is less than 10. And then for our third statement, we'll increment I by 1 each time. Now for every single loop in the for loop, let's just print out the value that I is. Now when we run the code, you can see that I will actually print out from 0 all the way up to 9. Because 9 is the closest value we can get to that is actually less than 10. You can actually set multiple conditions. Let's say we also initialize another variable, j equals 5. Let's say we want to add another condition here. So let's say I has to be less than 10 and j has to be greater than 3. Now at the end here we can actually decrease j with j minus minus, and there, now we can also print out the value of j, but we'll make it a bit easier to read, so let's actually write value of I is, and then add our value, and then same with value of j is, and then add our value. So now, when we run this code will run until either one of the conditions is not true. I'll also add just an empty line here just to make the output look a bit cleaner. Now when we run the code, you can see it actually prints out the values only twice. Because once j gets to 4, that's actually the closest value j can get to while being greater than 3. So you can have multiple conditions and initialize multiple variables in the same for loop. One last thing is that you can actually have multiple for loops inside of each other. So if we just set a for loop that runs 5 times with the variable I, we can actually make a new for loop inside of that, and we'll set the variable to j. Make sure the variables are different because you can't initialize a variable twice. And set j has to run 4 times and j++. So now let's just print out I is, and then add the value of I, and j is, and add the value of j. So now looking at the output here, you can see that we actually run the j loop for every single iteration of the I loop. What that means is just that we loop through all of the j, meaning we go from 0 all the way to 3 for j, and then we move on to the next iteration of the I loop. And that's just because we're running a whole for loop for each iteration of the initial for loop. This can be extremely useful when working with 2-dimensional arrays. And of course, you can nest 3 for loops. So we'll set the variable to k is less than 3, k++. And the list goes on. You can nest as many as you want, and these are all useful in some scenario. Lastly, there's also one more variation of a for loop, and this is called a for each loop. A for each loop is used to iterate through some kind of collection, like an array or array list, without having to write a whole for loop for it. For each loops in Java share very similar functionality to normal for loops in Python. For each loops are used to run some specific code for each element of a collection. When declaring a for each loop, it has 2 parts. The first part will be our variable that we'll use to reference each element. This can be whatever you name, but you have to initialize it as the same type. Let's say we had an array of numbers, then we'd initialize it as int number. The next part is the collection itself. So in this case, our array would be called numbers, so we're just going to put in numbers. Remember, in this case, since we're using a for each loop, we actually separate the 2 parts with a colon and not a semicolon like we do in for loops. Now quickly, I'll just show you how easy it is to iterate through an array using a for each loop. First, I'll just make some array called sports. Next, we'll just set the value to some sports, so football, basketball, baseball. Now, if I want to iterate through this whole array and print out each of the sports, all I have to do is for string sport in my array of sports, print out the sport. Now when we run this code, you'll see that it'll actually print out each of the sports. Even though I didn't have to write out a whole for loop, all I did was write this single for each loop.